Sometimes the smallest changes in life can trigger the biggest battles. I never thought a simple fence would lead to a war, but here I am, about to tell you how an HOA's demand to clean up my farm turned into a fight for everything I've worked for. If you've ever faced someone trying to control your property, you'll want to hear this story. Make sure to subscribe to hear more stories like this one. You know that feeling when you look at something you've built with your own hands? That pride that wells up inside you? That's how I felt every time I looked at Willow Creek Farm, 20 acres of land that I'd transformed from overgrown fields into a working organic farm, complete with heritage vegetables, free-range chickens, and the most stubborn goats you've ever met. The farm wasn't just my home, it was my legacy, my retirement plan, and my piece of the American dream. I'm James Anderson, though most folks around Riverside Valley just call me Jim. I'd spent 15 years building this farm from nothing, turning what was once abandoned land into something productive and beautiful. Sure, it wasn't the prettiest place by suburban standards. My tractors weren't exactly lawn ornaments, and my compost piles weren't going to win any beauty contests. But every scratch on my barn doors and every dent in my fence posts told a story of honest work and real farming. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was up before dawn, coffee in one hand, work gloves in the other, heading out to check on my latest batch of organic tomatoes. The morning fog was just lifting off the fields, creating that magical moment when the world feels fresh and full of possibility. My old border collie Scout trotted alongside me, eager to start his daily routine of chasing the chickens away from my vegetable beds. The peace was shattered by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Now, in farming country, unexpected visitors usually mean one of three things. Someone's livestock got loose, someone needs to borrow equipment, or someone's selling something. But when I saw that gleaming white Tesla pull up my driveway, kicking up dust on its pristine paint job, I knew this was something different. The woman who stepped out looked about as out of place on my farm as a penguin in the desert. Linda Thompson, as she later introduced herself, wore designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. Her heels sank into the soft earth as she picked her way toward me, her nose wrinkling at the authentic farm smells that surrounded her. "Mr. Anderson," she called out, holding up a tablet like some sort of shield. "I represent the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. We need to discuss the condition of your property." I almost laughed. Oak Ridge Estates was that new luxury development they'd built about a mile down the road. You know the type? McMansions with perfectly manicured lawns and rules about what color you could paint your mailbox. But my farm predated their development by over a decade. I wasn't part of their association, and I had no intention of starting now. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly, "I think there's been a mistake. This is Willow Creek Farm. We're not part of Oak Ridge Estates." Linda's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched as she swiped through something on her tablet. "Actually, Mr. Anderson, according to our recent boundary assessment, your property falls within our expanded jurisdiction. We've received numerous complaints about the unsightly condition of your farm equipment, those enormous compost piles, and particularly that shabby fence line. It's affecting property values in our community." I felt my jaw tighten. Scout must have sensed my tension because he moved closer to my side, his usual friendly demeanor replaced with cautious observation. The fence she was referring to wasn't exactly a picket fence from a magazine cover, but it was sturdy, functional, and kept my livestock where they needed to be. "This is a working farm," I explained, gesturing to the fields around us. "Has been for 15 years. Those unsightly things you're talking about, they're essential tools and materials for organic farming. And that fence, it's built to last, not to look pretty in photographs." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line as she pulled up what looked like a formal document on her tablet. "We understand this is a working facility," she said, making it sound like I was running some sort of illegal operation. "But the HOA has standards that must be maintained. You'll need to clean up this mess, repaint all structures in approved colors, and replace that hideous fence with something more appropriate for our community aesthetic." That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This woman, who probably couldn't tell a tomato plant from a weed, was trying to tell me how to run my farm. The farm I'd built with my own hands, the farm that fed hundreds of local families, the farm that was entirely outside her jurisdiction. "Ms. Thompson," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, "I appreciate you taking the time to come out here, but I think you'll find that your HOA has no authority over my property. This is agricultural land, zoned for farming, and it's been that way long before Oak Ridge Estates existed." She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said she was just getting started. "We'll see about that, Mr. Anderson. Expect formal notice of violations in the mail, and I strongly suggest you start cleaning things up before this becomes difficult." As she turned and clicked her way back to her Tesla, I stood there, Scout at my side, watching her leave. The morning sun was higher now, illuminating my fields, my equipment, my life's work. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to fight back against their ridiculous demands. I was going to build an even higher fence, not to hide my farm, but to make a statement. This was my land, my work, and no HOA was going to tell me how to run it. The morning after Linda Thompson's visit, I woke up earlier than usual. Something about her threats had gotten under my skin, and sleep hadn't come easily. As I stepped onto my porch, steaming coffee in hand, the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. Scout bounded down the steps ahead of me, eager to start his morning rounds. That's when I noticed, hidden a thick manila envelope stuck between the slats of my old mailbox. My stomach tightened as I pulled it free, already knowing who it was from. Inside were dozens of photographs of my farm, each one marked with bright red circles and arrows, pointing to what they called violations. My tractors, my tools, my harvest bins, everything that made my farm functional was labeled as an eyesore. But what really got my blood boiling was the final page. A formal notice demanding I pay a $12,500 fine for continued non-compliance with community standards. They'd even included a helpful timeline for when I needed to repaint my barn in their approved shade of rustic burgundy, remove my compost piles, and replace my perfectly good fence with their approved design. A decorative white vinyl monstrosity that wouldn't last a week with my goats. I took the paperwork inside and spread it across my kitchen table, the one my grandfather had built decades ago. The same table where I planned my crop rotations and calculated my harvest yields was now covered with threats from people who'd probably never grown so much as a potato. As I read through their demands more carefully, something caught my eye. The letterhead listed Oak Ridge Estates as extending far beyond its actual boundaries. They'd somehow included nearly half a mile of surrounding properties in their jurisdiction. That morning, instead of heading to my fields, I drove into town. Pete Davidson at the hardware store was already pulling out fence posts when I walked. Word travels fast in small towns. "Heard about your HOA trouble, Jim," he said, stacking the posts on the counter. "Funny thing is, you're not the only one. They've been pushing their weight around with the Miller place, too." Bob Miller's farm sat on the other side of Oak Ridge Estates. And if they were hassling him too, this was bigger than just my property. I spent the next hour talking with Pete, learning how the HOA had been gradually expanding their reach, targeting properties that didn't fit their luxury community vision. On my way home, I stopped by the Greenwood County Municipal Building. Jenny Parker, the county clerk I'd known since high school, helped me pull the property records. Sure enough, there was no legal basis for Oak Ridge Estates to claim authority over my land. My property was still zoned agricultural, just as it had been for the past 50 years. But what I found next made my jaw drop. The HOA had quietly filed paperwork attempting to rezone several surrounding properties, including mine, as residential. They were trying to change the rules right under our noses. If they succeeded, they could force every working farm in the area to conform to their suburban standards or face daily fines. That evening, as I walked my property line with Scout, measuring for the new fence I was planning, a familiar Tesla, and pulled up. Linda Thompson stepped out, this time accompanied by two men in suits. They carried clipboards and cameras, already snapping pictures of my equipment. "Mr. Anderson," Linda called out, her voice carrying that same condescending tone. "I see you haven't begun the required cleanup. These gentlemen are from our architectural review board. They'll be documenting all ongoing violations." I stood my ground, Scout alert beside me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You folks are trespassing on private property," I said firmly. "And those cameras, you don't have permission to photograph my farm." The taller of the two men stepped forward, introducing himself as the HOA's legal consultant. He launched into a rehearsed speech about property values and community standards, but I cut him short. "Show me the legal document that gives you authority over my farm," I challenged. "Because according to county records, you don't have any." Linda's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. "Mr. Anderson, fighting this will only make things more difficult for you. We have the resources to pursue this matter indefinitely. Why not save yourself the trouble and comply?" "Because this isn't just about a fence or some farm equipment," I replied, my voice steady. "This is about protecting a way of life. You want to turn working farmland into your idea of a picture-perfect suburb. Not happening. Not on my land." As if to emphasize my point, one of my goats chose that moment to stick its head through the fence, bleating loudly. The legal consultant jumped, nearly dropping his clipboard, and Linda's face twisted in disgust. The whole scene would have been comical if the stakes weren't so serious. "You have 48 hours to begin removing these violations," Linda declared, already retreating to her Tesla. "After that, we'll be forced to take more severe action." I watched them leave, their fancy car kicking up dust on my gravel driveway. Instead of feeling intimidated, I felt more determined than ever. That evening, I made 3 important calls. The first was to Maria Rodriguez, a lawyer known for fighting against HOA overreach. The second was to Bob Miller, suggesting we combine our resources. The third was to Pete Davidson, doubling my order for fence posts. The next morning, bright and early, I started work on my new fence. It wasn't just going to be higher, it was going to be a statement. 8 feet tall, sturdy as a mountain, with each post set deep in concrete. I chose dark green paint instead of their approved colors and added solar-powered lights along the top. If they wanted to complain about my farm, they'd have to work harder to see it. Word spread quickly about my fence project. By noon, Bob Miller had shown up with his sons to help. Sarah Collins from the organic market brought lunch for everyone. Even Pete Davidson closed his store early to join in. What started as an act of defiance turned into a community effort, a statement that we weren't going to let some HOA bulldoze over our rural way of life. As we worked, more neighbors stopped by sharing their own stories of run-ins with Oak Ridge Estates. It became clear that Linda Thompson and her association had been systematically trying to reshape our entire area, pressing their authority far beyond their actual boundaries. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the strength of our farming community. By sunset, we'd completed the first section of fence. It stood proud and tall, a green wall of defiance against the HOA's demands. Looking at it, I felt a deep satisfaction. This wasn't just about protecting my farm anymore. It had become about standing up for our entire community's way of life. The morning after we finished the first section of the fence, I discovered just how far Linda Thompson was willing to go. A bright orange notice had been stapled to my front gate, declaring my property a public nuisance. The document was filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were escalating their attack. Maria Rodriguez, my attorney, arrived at the farm that afternoon, her sedan looking out of place among the tractors and farm equipment. She walked the property line with me, taking detailed notes and photographs of everything. The new fence, the existing structures, and especially the notice they'd posted. "They're overplaying their hand," Maria said, reviewing the documents spread across my kitchen table. "This nuisance claim is baseless. Your farm predates their development by years, and you're properly zoned for agricultural use. But Jim, there's something else you need to see." She pulled up a series of documents on her laptop. They were planning commission records from 6 months ago, showing Oak Ridge Estate's expansion plans. The HOA wasn't just trying to control existing properties. They were planning to transform the entire area into what they called a premium residential district. My farm, Bob's Place, and several other agricultural properties were marked for aesthetic improvement and eventual transition. "They're trying to force us out," I realized, the weight of it settling in my stomach. All these violations and fines, they're not just about the fence or the equipment. They want to drive us away so they can develop the land. Maria nodded grimly. "And they've got deep pockets. The development company behind Oak Ridge Estates has been buying up farmland all across the state, using HOAs as a weapon to pressure holdouts." As we discussed strategy, Scout started barking outside. Through the window, I spotted a drone hovering over my property, its camera clearly focused on my farm. The HOA had taken to surveillance now, probably looking for more violations to add to their list. I'd had enough. I called Frank Cooper at the county office, reporting the unauthorized drone surveillance. Within an hour, Sheriff Mark Wilson pulled up in his patrol car, lights flashing. He'd already received 3 other complaints about the same drone from neighboring properties. The sheriff was an old-school type who understood farm life. His family had worked these lands for generations before he went into law enforcement. "This has gone far enough," he said, writing up an official warning for unauthorized surveillance. "They can't just harass people on their own property." That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting at Betty's Country Kitchen. The place was packed, not just with farmers, but with folks from all over Riverside Valley who dealt with Oak Ridge Estate's expanding influence. Amy Chen from the local paper sat in the corner, taking notes as people shared their stories. Tony Martinez, who helped me with the harvest each season, stood up to speak. His family's small vegetable farm had received similar violation notices. Diana Foster, a real estate agent who'd lived in the area for decades, revealed that the HOA had been pressuring local agents to stop listing agricultural properties altogether, trying to control the market. As we talked, a pattern emerged. Linda Thompson wasn't just some overzealous HOA representative. She was part of a calculated plan to reshape our entire community. The violations they kept finding, the constant harassment, the surveillance. It was all meant to wear us down until we gave up and sold our land, but they'd miscalculated. Instead of intimidating us, their actions had united the community. Pete Davidson offered to supply materials at cost for anyone who wanted to build their own fortress fence. Sarah Collins organized a rotating schedule of volunteers to document any HOA intrusions or harassment. Even Jenny Parker from the county office stayed late to help people file official complaints about the drone surveillance. The next morning, I woke to find my new fence covered in bright yellow violation stickers. They'd plastered them everywhere, declaring the height excessive and the color non-compliant. But underneath those garish stickers, something else was happening. Local artists had begun painting murals on sections of the fence, scenes of farm life, rolling hills and flourishing crops. What the HOA meant as a mark of shame, our community had turned into a canvas for celebration. Maria called with an update. She discovered that Linda Thompson had failed to file crucial paperwork for the HOA's expansion plans. Their attempt to rezone our properties hadn't followed proper procedures, and she'd found evidence that they'd forged signatures on some of the documentation. As I walked my property that evening, looking at the fence that had become a symbol of resistance, I spotted Linda's Tesla parked at the end of my driveway. She stood there, phone in hand, apparently documenting more violations. But this time, she wasn't alone. Bob Miller and several other neighbors had parked their tractors along the road, forming a wall of steel and rubber that blocked her preferred photography spot. "You know, Linda," I called out, walking down to meet her. "There's something you folks at Oak Ridge Estates don't understand. Out here, we don't just own land, we're part of it. Every season, every crop, every early morning and late night adds another layer to our connection with this place. You can't erase that with fines and violation notices." She turned to face me, her composure cracking slightly. "This is inevitable, Mr. Anderson. Progress can't be stopped by sentiment. You're kind of farming this." She gestured dismissively at my fields. "It's obsolete. The future is planned communities, controlled development, order." "The future," I replied, "is whatever we choose to make it. And right here, right now, we're choosing to stand our ground." That evening, as the sun set behind my new fence, casting long shadows across the fields my grandfather had first plowed decades ago, I realized something important. This wasn't just a fight about property rights or zoning laws anymore. It was about preserving a way of life that was worth protecting, about showing that sometimes the best way to fight back isn't to hide. It's to stand taller, build stronger, and let your truth be seen. The week following Linda's confrontation brought an unexpected twist. Early Tuesday morning, a fleet of white vans pulled up to my property. Men in matching uniforms poured out, carrying clipboards and sophisticated-looking testing equipment. Their jackets bore the logo of Environmental Solutions, Inc., a company I'd later learn was owned by the same development corporation behind Oak Ridge Estates. "We're here to conduct a mandatory environmental assessment," announced their leader, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who introduced himself as Dr. Richards. He thrust a document toward me that looked official but reeked of fabricated authority. "We have concerns about potential contamination from your agricultural practices." Scout growled softly beside me, picking up on my tension. I stood my ground at the gate, phone already recording. "Unless you have a court order or proper documentation from the County Environmental Office, you're not stepping foot on my property." Dr. Richards smiled thinly, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Anderson, resistance will only complicate matters. We have reports of possible groundwater contamination from your organic composting methods. The HOA has a responsibility to protect the watershed." "Funny timing," I replied, noting how Linda's Tesla was parked just down the road, watching the scene unfold. "My organic farming practices have been certified for years. Where exactly did these reports come from?" Before he could answer, a familiar truck kicked up dust on the road. Frank Cooper from the county office. He stepped out, looking none too pleased. "I got a call about unauthorized environmental testing." He held up his badge. "Unless you folks have permits from my office, you need to clear out now." The speed with which the environmental team packed up their vans was almost comical. As they retreated, Frank handed me a thick envelope. You'll want to see this, Jim. We did some digging after those rezoning attempts, found some interesting connections between Oak Ridge Estates, environmental solutions, and half a dozen shell companies. Inside the envelope was a web of documents showing how the Development Corporation had been systematically targeting agricultural properties across 3 counties. They'd use HOAs to pressure farmers, manufacture environmental concerns, and eventually force sales at below-market prices. That afternoon, Maria Rodriguez called an emergency meeting at her office. The conference room was packed with affected farmers, including Bob Miller and Tony Martinez. Amy Chen from the paper was there too, her recorder running as Maria laid out what we'd discovered. They're not just targeting individual farms anymore, Maria explained, pinning documents to a board. This is a coordinated effort to eliminate agricultural zoning in the entire region. They're trying to create a legal precedent that could affect farming communities statewide. As we discussed strategy, Sarah Collins burst into the room. You all need to see this. She pulled up a live stream on her phone. Linda Thompson was giving an interview to a regional news station, standing in front of my fence. These agricultural properties pose a serious threat to the health and safety of our growing community, Linda declared, gesturing at my farm. The unsightly conditions, the environmental hazards, the constant noise and odors, it's destroying property values and endangering residents. The camera panned dramatically across my property, carefully angled to make my equipment look like an industrial dump. They'd waited until my compost was being turned to film, making sure to catch the steam rising off it in the morning air. That's it, I said, standing up. They want to talk about environmental impact. Let's show people the truth. Over the next few days, our community mobilized. Sarah organized a farm-to-table tour, inviting local media to see how organic farming actually worked. Bob Miller opened his farm for educational visits, showing school groups how sustainable agriculture benefited the environment. Tony Martinez documented everything with his drone, creating stunning aerial footage that showed the true beauty of our working farms. Pete Davidson cleared out his hardware store's community board, turning it into an information center about the HOA's tactics. Jenny Parker helped us file official requests for all HOA-related documents, using her knowledge of county systems to uncover more connections. But Linda Thompson had another card to play. Thursday morning, I found a court summons taped to my gate. Oak Ridge Estates was suing me for deliberate property devaluation and environmental negligence. They were demanding not just the removal of my fence, but the cessation of all agricultural activities within view of their development. Maria wasn't surprised. This is their standard play, she said, reviewing the lawsuit. They file outrageous claims, dragging farmers into expensive legal battles until they can't afford to fight anymore. But they've never faced opposition like this before. She was right. Within hours of the news spreading, local farmers started a legal defense fund. The organic market where I sold my produce organized a Save Our Farms campaign. Even residents from Oak Ridge Estates itself began reaching out, sharing stories about how Linda and her board had turned their dream homes into a nightmare of restrictions and fines. That evening, as I walked my fields with Scout, something caught my eye. A group of people had gathered by my fence, but they weren't there to protest. They were adding to the murals. Paintings of butterflies, bees, and flowing crops now stretched along the green panels. Children from the local school had attached hand-painted signs. Save Our Farms and Food Grows Here. Linda's Tesla drove by slowly, her face visible behind tinted windows. She saw the gathering, saw the community coming together to protect what mattered. For the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty in her expression. The next morning, I received an unexpected visit from Richard Bennett, one of Oak Ridge Estate's original homeowners. He walked up my driveway leaning on a cane, looking out of place in his pressed khakis, but determined. "I watched them build that development," he said, accepting a glass of water as we sat on my porch. "Bought in early, believed all their talk about premium living and exclusive community. Now I can't even plant a vegetable garden without filing 3 forms and getting approval for the color of my tomato stakes." He pulled out a folder of his own documents, records of HOA meetings, emails, and internal memos. "Linda Thompson doesn't speak for all of us," he said firmly. "Some of us moved here because we wanted to be close to farms like yours, not to destroy them." As Scout lay at our feet, listening to Richard share vital information about the HOA's inner workings, I realized the tide was turning. Linda Thompson had tried to paint this as a simple case of progress versus tradition, order versus chaos. Instead, she'd revealed the truth about who really cared about community, environment, and responsible land use. The documents Richard Bennett provided opened a floodgate of revelations. Sitting at my kitchen table with Maria Rodriguez, we pored over years of HOA meeting minutes, financial records, and private correspondence. The picture they painted was darker than we'd imagined. "Look at this," Maria said, highlighting a section of an email chain. 6 months before Oak Ridge Estates broke ground, they were already planning to expand their jurisdiction. They specifically targeted properties with aging owners, expecting them to sell under pressure. The dates lined up perfectly with when several local farms had mysteriously changed hands. The Wilkinson Dairy Farm, the Green Family Orchard, places that had been part of our community for generations, had suddenly sold to shell companies connected to Oak Ridge Estates' parent corporation. A knock at my door interrupted our research. Amy Chen stood on my porch, clutching her laptop with an urgent expression. "You need to see what they're planning," she said, settling into a chair beside us. She pulled up a series of architectural renderings, plans for Oak Ridge Estates Phase 2, premium living expansion. The images showed my farm transformed into rows of cookie-cutter luxury homes. My fields were replaced with manicured lawns, my barn converted into a rustic-themed community center. They'd even marked out space for a golf course where my organic vegetables grew. The date on the plans was from 3 months ago, long before Linda Thompson had ever set foot on my property. "They're presenting these plans at tomorrow's county commission meeting," Amy explained. "They're trying to fast-track the rezoning process while everyone's distracted by the lawsuit." Maria was already reaching for her phone. "They can't submit development plans for land they don't own," she said, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she typed out emails. "This is exactly the kind of overreach we need to expose." That evening, word spread through our farming community like wildfire. Sarah Collins organized an emergency meeting at Betty's Country Kitchen, but the crowd was so large we had to move it to the high school gymnasium. Farmers, local business owners, and even Oak Ridge residents packed the bleachers. Pete Davidson brought in large copies of the development plans, posting them on the gym walls. Tony Martinez projected photos showing the reality of what they wanted to destroy: thriving organic farms, historic buildings, and vital wildlife corridors. "They're not just attacking our farms," Bob Miller declared, standing to address the crowd. "They're trying to erase our way of life. Once they turn this land into suburbs, it can never go back to agriculture. The soil will be dead, the wildlife gone, the knowledge lost." As if to punctuate his words, Sheriff Mark Wilson stepped forward with his own revelation. "My office has been investigating reports of tampering with property records," he announced. "Someone's been backdating documents, trying to make it look like these farms were always meant for residential development." The mood in the gym shifted from concern to determination. Diana Foster, the real estate agent, shared data showing how working farms actually increased property values in mixed-use areas. People pay premium prices to live near organic farms, she explained. The HOA's claims about property devaluation are completely backward. Jenny Parker had brought county maps dating back 50 years, proving that our land had been continuously zoned for agriculture. They can't just erase history because it doesn't fit their development plans, she said, her voice firm. As the meeting continued, Richard Bennett struggled to his feet. The elderly Oak Ridge resident commanded immediate attention. "I've lived here for 70 years, he began, his voice shaking with emotion. "Watched these farms feed our community through good times and bad. Linda Thompson and her corporate backers don't care about property values or environmental protection. They care about profit. They've turned our HOA into a weapon against our neighbors, and it's time we stopped them." The next morning dawned bright and crisp. As I walked my property line, checking the fence that had started this whole fight, I noticed something extraordinary. Cars were parked along my access road, not HOA inspectors this time, but local families. Children pressed their faces against my fence, watching the chickens scratch in the dirt. Parents pointed out different crops, explaining where their food came from. Linda Thompson's Tesla rolled past slowly, but this time she didn't stop. The crowd of supporters served as a human shield, making her usual harassment impossible. Through her tinted windows, I could see her speaking angrily into her phone. At 10 o'clock, Maria called with news. She'd filed an emergency injunction to stop the county commission meeting. They violated at least 6 different planning regulations, she explained. They can't present development plans for property they don't own, and they definitely can't rezone land without proper environmental impact studies. But we knew legal battles were only part of the solution. That afternoon, Sarah Collins unveiled her masterstroke, a campaign called Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food. She'd organized a series of farm tours, workshops, and community events designed to show exactly what the HOA wanted to destroy. "If they want to talk about property values," Sarah announced to a crowd gathered near my new fence, "let's show them the real value of farmland, not just in dollars but in food security, environmental stewardship and community strength." Tony Martinez's drone footage captured it all. Children learning about organic farming techniques, families picking fresh vegetables, local chefs giving cooking demonstrations using our produce. The images were a far cry from the nuisance property Linda Thompson had tried to portray. As the sun began to set, I stood by my fence watching the last visitors leave. The murals painted by local artists glowed in the evening light, telling our story in vibrant colors and bold strokes. Scout sat beside me, his tail thumping against the ground as Amy Chen approached for one final interview. "The county commission meeting is tomorrow," she said, setting up her recorder. "What message do you have for people who think this is just about a fence or property values?" I looked out over my fields, where generations of careful stewardship had built something precious. "This land isn't just dirt and crops," I replied. "It's a living system, a connection between past and future. When you destroy farmland for development, you're not just losing buildings and fields, you're losing knowledge, tradition, and a way of life that sustains us all. Some things are worth more than property values. Some things are worth fighting for." The morning of the county commission meeting brought an unexpected surprise. A television news van was parked at the end of my driveway, lights blazing in the pre-dawn darkness. The reporter, Rebecca Torres from Channel 7, stood ready with her microphone as I stepped outside. "Mr. Anderson, we've received information about illegal pesticide use on your property," she announced, shoving the microphone toward my face. "How do you respond to allegations that your organic farm is actually contaminating local groundwater?" Behind her, I spotted Linda Thompson's Tesla idling down the road, its windows tinted against the morning sun. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. They were trying to discredit me before the commission meeting. Ms. Torres, I replied calmly, I welcome any legitimate investigation of my farming practices. My organic certification records are public, and I've maintained detailed logs of every substance used on this farm for the past 15 years. Would you like to see them? The reporter hesitated, clearly expecting a different response. Before she could reply, Sarah Collins' truck pulled up, followed by 3 more vehicles. Local chefs and restaurant owners stepped out, carrying crates of produce grown on my farm. We're here to testify about Jim's organic practices, announced Michael Chen, owner of Riverside's most popular farm-to-table restaurant. We've been buying his vegetables for years. Would you like to know why we trust his methods more than any corporate farm? The story was already shifting away from Linda's planned narrative. More vehicles arrived. Customers who'd bought my produce at farmers' markets. Parents whose children had attended farm education programs. Even a soil scientist from the state university who'd studied my organic farming techniques. The reporter's camera operator swung away from me, capturing instead the stream of community members arriving to show support. Each person carried something from my farm. Fresh vegetables, eggs, honey, or photos showing the transformation of this land over the years. Linda's Tesla peeled away, leaving a trail of dust. Her attempted media ambush had backfired spectacularly, turning into a spontaneous demonstration of community support. But we knew this was just the beginning of what would be a crucial day. The county commission meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. As I drove into town, a line of tractors appeared in my rearview mirror. Bob Miller had organized a convoy of local farmers, each machine decorated with banners defending agricultural land rights. The slow procession of farm equipment created a powerful visual statement as we approached the county building. The parking lot was already full. Jenny Parker met me at the entrance, her arms full of documents. They've brought in lawyers from the state capitol, she whispered. 3 of them. They're trying to argue that the development plans were part of the original Oak Ridge Estates approval. Inside the commission chamber, the atmosphere was tense. Linda Thompson sat with her lawyers and development team, their suits and briefcases contrasting sharply with the work clothes and weathered hands of the farmers filling the public seats. Richard Bennett had claimed a front row spot, his cane propped against his chair as he stared down the HOA representatives. Maria Rodriguez arrived moments before the meeting began, carrying a thick folder of her own. "Remember," she murmured as she passed, "let them make their case first. The more they talk, the more they'll expose their real intentions." The commission chairman, Eleanor Matthews, called the meeting to order. Linda's lead attorney stood, launching into a sleek presentation about property values, tax revenue, and modernization. Glossy renderings showed their vision of my farm, transformed into luxury homes and manicured lawns. "The current agricultural use of these properties is outdated and inefficient," he declared, pointing to charts showing projected tax revenues. "Our development plan will bring millions in new property taxes and create a modern, sustainable community." The word "sustainable" triggered murmurs of disagreement from the crowd. When the attorney finally sat down, Maria stood, her expression calm but determined. "Before we discuss development plans," she began, "I'd like to address some legal concerns." She distributed packets to the commissioners. "The documents before you show that Oak Ridge Estates has engaged in a pattern of deceptive practices, including falsified property records and fraudulent rezoning applications." The chamber erupted in whispers as the commissioners flipped through the evidence. Maria continued, methodically exposing each layer of deception. The backdated documents, the fake environmental complaints, the manipulated property boundaries. Then she played her trump card. "I've also submitted evidence that the development corporation behind Oak Ridge Estates has been charged with similar fraudulent practices in 3 other counties. They're currently under federal investigation for environmental violations and real estate fraud. Linda's face drained of color. Her attorneys huddled together, whispering urgently. But Maria wasn't finished. She called forward a series of witnesses, farmers, scientists, economists, each testifying about the value of preserving agricultural land. Dr. Sarah Peterson, the soil scientist, explained how converting farmland to residential development permanently destroyed its agricultural potential. Once you lay down roads and foundations, compact the soil and alter the water table, you can't simply turn it back into productive farmland, she explained. We're losing viable agricultural land at an alarming rate. Michael Chen spoke about food security and the importance of local farms. During recent supply chain disruptions, it was local farms like Jim's that kept our community fed, he reminded the commission. You can't eat golf courses and luxury homes. The testimony continued for hours. Each speaker added another piece to the puzzle, showing how the HOA's claims about property values and environmental concerns were not just false, but deliberately misleading. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every farmer and landowner's eyes upon me. Scout, who'd been lying quietly at my feet, raised his head attentively. 15 years ago, this land was abandoned, I began. The soil was depleted, the wildlife gone. Through years of careful organic practices, we've rebuilt its health. Now it produces food for hundreds of families, provides habitat for wildlife, and serves as a living classroom for future generations. I gestured to the HOA's development plans displayed on the wall. They call this progress. They want to pave over living soil, replace diverse ecosystems with sterile lawns, and destroy a way of life that has sustained this community for generations. But real progress isn't about erasing the past, it's about building on it sustainably. From the back of the chamber came a commotion. Another group of Oak Ridge Estates residents had arrived, led by Richard Bennett's daughter. They carried their own petition, signed by over half of the development's homeowners, opposing the HOA's expansion plans and supporting the preservation of surrounding farmland. Linda Thompson's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. As the new residents testified about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and their desire to live near working farms, not destroy them, I watched her slip quietly from the chamber, leaving her attorneys to handle the fallout. The day after the commission meeting, an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a thumb drive and a handwritten note. You need to see this. Be careful. The handwriting matched Richard Bennett's shaky script. Maria Rodriguez came over immediately to review the contents. As we huddled around my laptop, Scout keeping watch by the window, folders of internal emails and documents revealed themselves. The Development Corporation's plans went far beyond our small community. They've been systematically targeting agricultural areas across the state, Maria said, scrolling through spreadsheets, using HOAs as legal shields while they acquire land through pressure tactics. Your farm wasn't just a target. It was meant to be a test case. The documents showed how Oak Ridge Estates was designed as a prototype. If they succeeded in forcing out local farmers here, they planned to replicate the strategy statewide. The environmental complaints, the fraudulent rezoning attempts, the media manipulation, it was all carefully orchestrated. A knock at the door made us jump. Sheriff Mark Wilson stood on my porch, his expression grim. "Got something you should know," he said, settling into a kitchen chair. "Someone broke into the county records office last night. They were specifically targeting agricultural zoning files." My stomach tightened. The break-in couldn't be a coincidence. "Any leads?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Mark shook his head. "Security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned, but here's the interesting part. Nothing was stolen. Files were just rearranged. like someone wanted to create confusion about property boundaries and zoning histories. Maria was already pulling up the thumb drive files. "Look at this email," she said, pointing to her screen. 2 weeks ago, Linda Thompson requested permission to rectify historical documentation discrepancies. They knew they were losing the legal battle, so they tried to change the evidence. The sheriff leaned forward, studying the email. "That's enough for a warrant, but we need to move fast. These people have connections. They'll try to bury the evidence." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Jenny Parker. "Emergency meeting called at Oak Ridge Estates. Something big happening." Within an hour, the news spread through our farming community. The HOA board had convened a special session, closed to the public. But Richard Bennett's daughter, Elizabeth, was a board member. She managed to slip away during a break, meeting us at Betty's Country Kitchen. "They're dissolving the current HOA," she explained breathlessly, "creating a new entity under a different name. They're trying to dodge the legal challenges by technically becoming a new organization." Maria's eyes narrowed. "They can't just escape liability by changing names. But they could delay proceedings, drain our resources with new legal battles." Sarah Collins, who'd been listening from nearby, stood up. "Then we need to move faster than they can. We've got evidence of their plans now. Why wait for them to regroup?" She was right. The thumb drive contents weren't just evidence of local misconduct. They revealed a statewide conspiracy to destroy agricultural communities. Amy Chen from the paper had already started fact-checking the documents, preparing a major exposé. Tony Martinez's drone footage had captured something else interesting: late-night meetings between Linda Thompson and developers at abandoned properties around the county. Properties that, according to the thumb drive documents, were next on their target list. The next morning, I woke to the sound of vehicles on my access road. But instead of HOA inspectors or fake environmental testers, I found a group of local farmers setting up tables and tents. Sarah Collins had organized an impromptu farmers market right along my controversial fence. "They want to talk property." "Values," Sarah called out, arranging fresh produce. "Let's show them the real value of local farms." Customers began arriving, including residents from Oak Ridge Estates itself. Many expressed shock when they learned about their HOA's true agenda. The development they'd bought into had been marketed as sustainable luxury living, with access to local farms and fresh produce. Instead, their HOA dues were funding a campaign to destroy the very amenities that had attracted them. Elizabeth Bennett organized a meeting of concerned Oak Ridge residents in her father's garage. The crowd spilled out into the driveway as homeowners shared their own stories of HOA overreach and deception. "We bought here because we wanted to be part of a rural community," one resident explained, "not to destroy it." As the meeting continued, Pete Davidson arrived with news from his contacts in neighboring counties. Other farming communities had started receiving similar pressure from newly formed HOAs, all following the same playbook we'd uncovered. Maria worked through the night, preparing legal documents. The evidence from the thumb drive didn't just support our case. It revealed violations of state and federal laws, environmental regulations, real estate statutes, banking laws. The Development Corporation's scheme had crossed numerous legal boundaries. The next morning, I found Linda Thompson standing by my fence, alone. She looked different, tired, less polished. The weight of what was coming seemed to have settled on her shoulders. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said, not meeting my eyes. "The plan was simple: pressure the farmers, buy the land cheap, develop it for massive profits. No one was supposed to fight back this hard." "Did you really think we wouldn't?" I asked, Scout watching her warily from my side. "This land isn't just property to us. It's our life's work, our heritage, our future." She turned to face me, her expression hard. "The world is changing, Mr. Anderson. Small farms, organic methods, they're relics. Progress means development, expansion, control. Progress without wisdom is just destruction, I replied. And your kind of progress leaves nothing but sterile suburbs and dead soil in its wake. Linda's phone buzzed. Her face paled as she read the message. Without another word, she hurried to her Tesla and drove away. Later that day, we learned why. Federal agents had arrived at the Development Corporation's state offices with search warrants. The evidence Richard Bennett had provided didn't just expose local corruption, it revealed a nationwide pattern of agricultural land theft through fraudulent HOA schemes. What started as a fight over a fence had uncovered something much bigger. That evening, as the sun set behind my strengthened fence, now covered in community artwork and support messages, I walked my fields with Scout. The crops were thriving, ignorant of the battles being fought over them. A family of deer grazed peacefully at the field's edge, unaware that their habitat had nearly been transformed into manicured lawns. Sarah Collins's words from earlier echoed in my mind. They thought they were fighting one farmer over a fence. Instead, they awakened an entire community to the value of what they were trying to destroy. Federal agents swarmed the Oak Ridge Estates Management Office early Monday morning. Through my kitchen window, I watched their vehicles roll past my farm, lights flashing in the dawn mist. Agent Sandra Martinez, the lead investigator, had contacted me the previous evening, requesting access to my property records and documentation of all HOA interactions. The scale of the investigation expanded hourly. What began as a local dispute over a fence had exposed a sophisticated network of land acquisition schemes targeting agricultural communities nationwide. The development corporation behind Oak Ridge estates operated under dozens of different names, but their tactics remained consistent: establish HOAs, manufacture violations, pressure landowners to sell. By mid-morning, Amy Chen arrived breathless at my door. She'd just returned from the Oak Ridge Estates office. "They're seizing everything," she reported, notebook in hand. Computers, files, even Linda Thompson's personal devices. But that's not the biggest news. They found a hidden room full of shredded documents. Maria Rodriguez called an emergency meeting at her office. Local farmers gathered around her conference table as she explained the legal implications of the federal investigation. "They're not just looking at fraud anymore," she explained. "There's evidence of money laundering, environmental violations, and potential racketeering charges." Bob Miller leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. "What about our farms? Can they still force us out?" Maria shook her head. "The development plans are frozen. Any action by the HOA or the Development Corporation is now subject to federal oversight, but we need to stay vigilant. Corporations like this don't give up easily." She was right. By afternoon, we discovered that Linda Thompson had disappeared, leaving behind a trail of encrypted files and suspicious bank transfers. Sheriff Mark Wilson reported that she'd been seen boarding a private plane at the regional airport just hours before the raid began. Elizabeth Bennett arrived at my farm later that day, carrying boxes of HOA documents from her father's collection. "Dad kept everything," she explained, spreading papers across my kitchen table, meeting minutes, private correspondence, even notes from conversations he overheard at the clubhouse. He knew something wasn't right from the beginning. As we sorted through the papers, a pattern emerged. The Development Corporation had specifically targeted areas with aging agricultural populations, betting that older farmers would lack the resources or energy to fight back. They hadn't counted on communities uniting to protect their heritage. Tony Martinez's drone captured stunning footage of federal agents methodically documenting every inch of the Oak Ridge Estates office. But he also recorded something more significant: residents emerging from their homes to talk with their neighbors, many for the first time. The HOA's strict rules about gatherings and social events had kept the community artificially divided. Sarah Collins organized an impromptu community dinner at Betty's Country Kitchen, bringing together farmers and Oak Ridge residents. The conversation flowed freely as people shared stories of their experiences with the HOA. Many residents admitted they'd been drawn to Oak Ridge Estates by promises of a rural lifestyle, only to find themselves unwitting participants in a scheme to destroy the very environment they'd hoped to enjoy. Pete Davidson arrived with news from his industry contacts. Hardware stores across 3 states have reported similar patterns, he announced. HOAs suddenly demanding specific fencing materials, then filing violations when farmers refused to comply. It was all coordinated. Frank Cooper from the county office brought updated zoning maps. "Look at this," he said, spreading them on a separate table. "Every property they targeted sits on aquifers or prime agricultural soil. They weren't just after land, they were systematically destroying our most valuable farming resources." As the evening progressed, Agent Martinez returned to interview more residents. She set up a temporary office in the back room, taking statements from a steady stream of people eager to share their experiences with the HOA's tactics. Jenny Parker had discovered something interesting in the county archives. The original Oak Ridge Estates permits had included provisions for agricultural buffer zones and protection of existing farms. These requirements had been quietly altered through a series of seemingly minor amendments, each pushed through during holiday periods when public attention was minimal. The next morning brought more revelations. The federal investigation had uncovered links between the Development Corporation and several prominent politicians who had championed legislation making it easier to rezone agricultural land for development. Diana Foster, the real estate agent, arrived with market analysis reports. Property values in Oak Ridge Estates have actually dropped since they started targeting local farms, she explained. Turns out people will pay premium prices to live near working organic farms. The HOA's claims about property devaluation were completely backward. Richard Bennett, despite his frail health, insisted on testifying to federal investigators. His detailed records of HOA meetings and private conversations provided crucial evidence of the corporation's true intentions. "They thought old folks like me wouldn't notice," he said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "But we've seen too much history to let them destroy what matters." By sunset, the federal agents had filled several trucks with evidence from the Oak Ridge Estates office. Agent Martinez paused at my fence before leaving, studying the community artwork that now covered its surface. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "we've investigated dozens of land fraud cases, but this is different. Most communities fragment under pressure. Yours got stronger. That fence became more than a barrier. It became a symbol of resistance." As darkness fell, I walked my property with Scout, checking the evening security measures that had become habit during the HOA disputes. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of frogs by the pond and the rustle of corn leaves in the gentle breeze. The lights of Oak Ridge Estates glowed on the horizon, but they seemed less threatening now. The development's residents were organizing their own meetings, discussing how to restructure their community association into something that would protect both suburban and agricultural interests. Sarah Collins texted updates about plans for a weekend farmers market in the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center parking lot, something that would have been unthinkable under Linda Thompson's reign. The same parking lot where she had once staged protests against local farms would now host the very farmers she had tried to drive away. Standing by my reinforced fence, I realized that our fight had achieved something beyond protecting individual farms. We'd exposed a threat that had been silently destroying agricultural communities across the country, and in doing so, we'd helped forge a new kind of rural-suburban alliance. The fence that was meant to divide had become a gathering place, a canvas for community expression, and a reminder that some things are worth standing up for. A week into the federal investigation, Agent Martinez called an unexpected press conference outside the Greenwood County Courthouse. Camera crews from major networks gathered as she stepped up to the microphone, flanked by federal prosecutors. The evidence uncovered in Oak Ridge Estates had led to indictments against 26 individuals across 12 states. This investigation has revealed a coordinated effort to destroy agricultural communities through fraudulent homeowners associations, she announced. The defendants used shell companies, falsified environmental reports, and illegal harassment tactics to force farmers off their land. Among those indicted were 3 state legislators, a prominent banking executive, and the CEO of the development corporation behind Oak Ridge Estates. Linda Thompson's name appeared on the list, though she remained at large, reportedly last seen in a private airport in Mexico. Maria Rodriguez arrived at my farm that afternoon, carrying printouts of the indictments. They're calling it Operation Harvest Trust, she explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table. The federal prosecutors are treating it as a RICO case, organized criminal enterprise targeting agricultural communities. The scope of their operation was staggering. Oak Ridge Estates was just one node in a vast network of fraudulent developments. They'd identified over 50 similar schemes nationwide, each following the same playbook. Establish luxury developments near productive farmland, create aggressive HOAs, then systematically harass and pressure neighboring farmers until they sold. Sarah Collins organized a community meeting to discuss the implications. The high school gymnasium filled with a mix of farmers, Oak Ridge residents, and concerned citizens. Agent Martinez attended, along with representatives from the Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency. The damage goes beyond land theft, explained Dr. Marcus Chen, an EPA soil scientist. These developments were specifically targeting properties with the richest agricultural soil and most crucial water resources. Once paved over and developed, this farmland is essentially lost forever. Elizabeth Bennett stood to address the crowd, her voice shaking with emotion. My father always said something felt wrong about Oak Ridge Estates. The way they marketed it as sustainable luxury living while actively working to destroy the farms that made our area special. We were sold a lie, and we nearly helped them destroy something precious. The meeting evolved into a planning session for the future. Without Linda Thompson's oppressive regulations, Oak Ridge residents were free to reimagine their community. Ideas flowed freely. Community gardens, farm-to-table events, educational programs connecting suburban families with agricultural heritage. Pete Davidson brought architectural drawings for modified fencing that would allow views of farmland while still protecting crops and livestock. We can have boundaries without barriers, he explained, security without isolation. Tony Martinez's drone footage had become crucial evidence in the federal case. His detailed documentation of nighttime activities, suspicious meetings, and property violations had helped prosecutors establish patterns of organized harassment. Now he was using his skills to create virtual tours of local farms, helping urban residents understand the value of what we'd fought to protect. Jenny Parker arrived with updated county maps showing the full extent of the development corporation's land grabs. Properties they'd acquired through pressure tactics were marked in red, creating a stark visual of how close we'd come to losing our agricultural heritage. But look at this, she said, overlaying a second map. Properties marked in green showed land being returned to agricultural use or protected through conservation easements. The green patches were spreading, pushing back against the red tide of development. Frank Cooper shared news from the county commission. We're drafting new zoning regulations, he announced. Special protections for agricultural land, mandatory, buffer zones between developments and farms, strict oversight of HOA formation and authority. Diana Foster's real estate expertise had proved invaluable to investigators. She tracked how the Development Corporation manipulated property values using artificial drops to pressure farmers into selling, then artificially inflating prices once land was rezoned for development. The really criminal part, she explained, was how they used HOA dues to fund their harassment campaigns. Homeowners were unknowingly paying for the destruction of the very farms that made their properties valuable. As the meeting continued, Bob Miller shared plans for a new agricultural education center. The community was converting an abandoned warehouse into a space where farmers could share knowledge, demonstrate techniques, and connect with suburban families interested in sustainable living. "They tried to paint us as relics of the past," he said, gesturing to architectural renderings. "But sustainable farming is the future. People are hungry for real connection with their food and their environment." Sheriff Mark Wilson provided updates on the ongoing investigation. Deputies had discovered hidden cameras and surveillance equipment around targeted farms, evidence of how thoroughly the HOA had monitored and harassed local farmers. "They documented everything," he explained. "Every tractor movement, every compost pile, every visitor. They were building dossiers to use against farmers who resisted their pressure tactics." Amy Chen's investigative reporting had gone national. Major newspapers were picking up the story, exposing how development corporations used HOAs as weapons against agricultural communities. Her articles sparked investigations in other states, revealing similar patterns of abuse and land theft. That evening, as the meeting wound down, Agent Martinez pulled me aside. "Your fence started something bigger than anyone expected," she said. "It became a line in the sand, a place where people finally said enough. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance spark the biggest changes." Walking home under the stars, Scout trotting faithfully beside me, I passed my reinforced fence. The community artwork covering it had evolved. New murals showed farms and suburbs existing in harmony, connected by paths of understanding rather than divided by walls of regulation. A group of Oak Ridge residents had gathered near the fence, discussing plans for a community garden. They waved as I passed, calling out questions about soil preparation and planting schedules. The barrier that Linda Thompson had tried to use as a weapon had become a gathering place, a symbol of connection rather than division. Richard Bennett sat in his usual spot on his porch, watching the evening activity. "You know," he called out as I passed, "they thought they could erase history with luxury homes and manicured lawns. But they forgot that real luxury is having fresh food, clean soil, and neighbors who care about more than property values." The capture of Linda Thompson made national headlines. Federal agents apprehended her at a small airport in Nicaragua, attempting to board a private jet to an undisclosed location. Agent Martinez delivered the news personally, arriving at my farm as the morning fog lifted from the fields. She had 3 different passports and access codes to offshore accounts, Martinez explained, accepting a cup of coffee in my kitchen. But what's more interesting is what she was carrying, a laptop containing records of similar operations, planned for agricultural communities across the country. The federal prosecution team worked through the night, analyzing the data. By morning, they'd identified 47 additional target zones where development corporations had begun establishing HOAs near productive farmland. The pattern was always the same: create luxury developments, expand HOA jurisdiction, then systematically pressure neighboring farms until they sold. Maria Rodriguez called an emergency meeting at the courthouse. The room buzzed with energy as she laid out the latest findings. The laptop contained emails between Linda and high-ranking executives discussing their rural acquisition strategy in coldly clinical terms. They'd calculated exactly how long it would take to break each. Farmers will, through constant harassment and mounting fines. What's crucial, Maria explained, highlighting key documents, is that these emails prove the harassment wasn't just overzealous HOA enforcement. It was a calculated corporate strategy to devalue agricultural land and force sales. Samuel Wright, a senior federal prosecutor, took the podium next. His team had traced the money trail through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. The development corporation hadn't just been stealing land. They'd been laundering money through fake HOA fees and inflated construction costs. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered as Amy Chen broadcasted live updates. Oak Ridge residents stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers, united in their determination to protect their community from corporate predators. The story had struck a chord nationally, highlighting the threat to agricultural communities everywhere. Back at my farm, Sarah Collins unveiled plans for a new initiative, the Agricultural Heritage Protection Network. Working with legal experts and community organizers, they'd created a framework to help other farming communities recognize and resist similar takeover attempts. They counted on isolating us, Sarah explained, pointing to a map of connected farming communities. But we're creating something they didn't expect, a network of informed, prepared communities ready to stand together. Tony Martinez's drone footage had become a powerful tool in the federal case. His systematic documentation of HOA harassment showed clear patterns of targeted intimidation. But now he was using his skills differently, creating virtual tours of thriving agricultural communities to share with urban planners and policymakers. Elizabeth Bennett organized a community forum in the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse, the same room where Linda Thompson had once plotted to destroy neighboring farms. Now it was filled with residents eager to rebuild relationships with their farming neighbors. They shared ideas for collaborative projects, from community-supported agriculture programs to educational partnerships with local schools. Pete Davidson's hardware store had become an unofficial command center for the Agricultural Heritage Protection Network. Farmers from neighboring counties came seeking advice on strengthening their defenses against corporate takeovers. His wall displayed a growing collection of HOA warning letters, each one marking another community standing up to development pressure. The federal investigation expanded as more communities came forward with similar stories. Agent Martinez's team uncovered a pattern of environmental fraud. Development corporations deliberately contaminating farmland to create evidence for their health and safety complaints. Jenny Parker discovered something crucial in the county: archives, original land grants protecting agricultural use. These centuries-old documents provided legal foundation for preserving farmland against modern development schemes. Similar documents existed in communities across the country, forgotten but not void. Sheriff Mark Wilson coordinated with law enforcement agencies nationwide, creating protocols for recognizing and responding to organized agricultural harassment. His deputies had already prevented 3 attempts to plant false evidence on local farms. Frank Cooper worked late into the night, drafting new zoning regulations that would protect agricultural communities from HOA overreach. The ordinances would require transparent boundaries, democratic governance, and respect for existing land use. The transformation of Oak Ridge Estates continued as residents reclaimed their community from corporate control. Gardens sprouted in previously restricted areas. Children visited neighboring farms for hands-on learning experiences. The development's rigid boundaries softened as people recognized the value of connecting with their agricultural heritage. Richard Bennett, whose careful documentation had helped expose the scheme, watched from his porch as young families planted vegetables in their formerly regulation-perfect lawns. The HOA's strict landscaping rules had given way to a new appreciation for productive, sustainable gardens. Diana Foster's real estate office displayed a new kind of property listing, homes with agricultural connections, promoting access to local farms as a premium feature. The market responded enthusiastically, proving that people valued authentic community connections over artificial exclusivity. Bob Miller established a mentorship program, connecting experienced farmers with Oak Ridge residents interested in sustainable agriculture. The sessions covered everything from soil health to water conservation, building bridges of understanding between urban and rural perspectives. Agent Martinez brought more news as the investigation deepened. Linda Thompson's laptop revealed connections to international investment groups specializing in agricultural land acquisition. The scheme went beyond simple real estate development. It was part of a global effort to control food production resources. The federal case expanded to include charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and environmental crimes. Each new piece of evidence revealed the elaborate planning behind the seemingly simple HOA harassment. They'd studied each community, identified pressure points, and calculated exactly how to break down resistance. As evening settled over my farm, Scout and I walked the perimeter one last time. The fence that had started this battle now stood as a monument to community resistance. Its surface told our story in murals and messages, a visual reminder that some things are worth fighting for. A group of Oak Ridge children had gathered by the fence, learning about composting from Sarah Collins. Their parents chatted nearby, sharing plans for expanding their community garden program. The barrier that was meant to divide had become a place of connection and learning. The stars emerged as night fell, bright and clear above the fields. Tomorrow would bring more developments in the federal case, more communities seeking help, more battles to fight. But tonight, watching the fireflies rise above my strengthened fence, I knew we'd already won something precious. The understanding that true community strength comes not from walls and regulations, but from people standing together to protect what matters. The morning of the federal trial dawned crisp and clear. Autumn colors painted the trees along my fence line as I prepared to testify. Maria Rodriguez had spent weeks preparing me for this moment, but nothing could fully ready me for facing Linda Thompson across a courtroom. Agent Martinez met me outside the federal courthouse, her usual confident demeanor tinged with unexpected emotion. "This case has changed things," she said quietly as we climbed the stone steps. "We're not just prosecuting individuals anymore. We're challenging a system that's been destroying agricultural communities for decades." Inside, the courtroom hummed with tension. Linda Thompson sat with her defense team, her previously immaculate appearance now subdued in prison attire. She avoided eye contact as I took the stand, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the defense table. My testimony lasted hours. I detailed every incident of harassment, every falsified violation, every attempt to pressure me off my land. The prosecution presented photographs of my fence, transformed from a simple boundary into a symbol of resistance. Security footage showed HOA representatives trespassing on my property, planting false evidence, and conducting illegal surveillance. During cross-examination, Linda's attorney tried to paint the HOA's actions as routine enforcement of community standards, but emails from her seized laptop told a different story. They revealed detailed strategies for targeting specific farms, choreographed harassment campaigns, and calculations of how long each farmer would likely hold out before selling. Elizabeth Bennett testified next, describing how Oak Ridge Estates residents had been manipulated into supporting the scheme. Her father's meticulous records proved that HOA fees had been diverted to fund the harassment campaign, while residents were fed false information about property values and environmental threats. The prosecution's forensic accountant presented a devastating analysis of the money trail, Shell companies, hidden accounts, falsified environmental reports, all carefully orchestrated to facilitate the takeover of agricultural land. The scheme had generated millions in profits while destroying farming communities across the country. Sarah Collins brought photographs documenting the transformation of our community. Images showed how the HOA's attempt to divide urban and rural residents had backfired, creating instead a model of sustainable coexistence. Gardens flourished where regulation lawns once stood. Children learned farming skills in previously restricted spaces. Tony Martinez's drone footage revealed the broader impact of development pressure on agricultural lands. Time-lapse sequences showed neighboring communities where corporate HOAs had succeeded. Productive farmland transformed into sterile subdivisions, rich soil buried under pavement and artificial turf. Dr. Marcus Chen, the EPA soil scientist, provided expert testimony about the environmental consequences. Once farmland was developed, he explained, its agricultural potential was effectively destroyed. The corporation's actions weren't just illegal. They were permanently damaging irreplaceable natural resources. During a court recess, Pete Davidson shared news from his growing network of hardware store owners. Similar development schemes had been identified in farming communities nationwide. But now, armed with knowledge of their tactics, these communities were successfully resisting corporate pressure. Jenny Parker brought historical records proving that much of the targeted land had been protected for agricultural use through original land grants. These centuries-old documents, combined with modern environmental protections, formed a legal barrier against unauthorized development. The federal prosecutor's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. This wasn't just a case about HOA overreach or real estate fraud. It was about protecting America's agricultural heritage from systematic corporate destruction. The jury needed less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Linda Thompson and her co-defendants were found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, environmental crimes. The Development Corporation faced massive fines and forced dissolution. But the judge's ruling went further, establishing legal precedent for protecting agricultural communities from similar schemes. Outside the courthouse, Agent Martinez addressed the waiting media. Cameras flashed as she announced the creation of a special task force dedicated to investigating corporate threats to agricultural land. My Fence's story had exposed a national crisis and sparked a federal response. Sarah Collins unveiled the next phase of the Agricultural Heritage Protection Network. Working with legal experts and community organizers, they developed resources to help farming communities recognize and resist corporate takeover attempts. The network would provide legal support, documentation strategies, and community organizing tools. Back at Oak Ridge Estates, residents were already implementing changes. The oppressive HOA had been replaced with a community council focused on promoting sustainable collaboration between urban and rural neighbors. Richard Bennett, now serving as senior advisor, helped ensure that protective measures remained strong. Diana Foster's real estate office became a hub for the new movement. Her team specialized in connecting mindful buyers with properties that supported agricultural preservation. The waiting list for homes near working farms grew longer each week, proving that people valued authentic community connections over artificial exclusivity. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of victory, community members gathered by my fence for an impromptu celebration. Children proudly showed off vegetables from their new gardens. Neighbors shared dishes made with locally grown ingredients. The barrier that was meant to divide us had become the heart of our united community. Frank Cooper announced that the county had adopted new zoning regulations inspired by our experience. Future developments would require agricultural impact studies and community approval. HOAs would face strict oversight and limitations on their authority over neighboring properties. Scout lounged contentedly at my feet as Bob Miller described plans for expanding the mentorship program. More urban residents were seeking to learn traditional farming skills, recognizing the value of agricultural knowledge in an increasingly uncertain world. The program had already spawned similar initiatives in communities across the state. Amy Chen's national coverage had sparked a broader conversation about the importance of protecting agricultural communities. Her articles exposed how corporate development strategies threatened food security, environmental stability, and cultural heritage. The response was overwhelming. People everywhere were waking up to the need for preserving productive farmland. As darkness fell, fireflies danced above my strengthened fence. The once controversial barrier now stood as a monument to community resilience, its surface alive with murals celebrating rural-urban connection. Linda Thompson had tried to use it as a weapon of division, but instead it had become a gathering place, a canvas for hope, a symbol of unity against corporate greed. The stars emerged bright and clear above fields that would remain productive for generations to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking guidance, new battles to fight. But tonight, surrounded by neighbors who had become a family, I knew we had accomplished something remarkable. We hadn't just saved our farms, we had created a model for protecting agricultural heritage everywhere. Spring arrived at Willow Creek Farm with a burst of new life. The morning sun illuminated fresh paint on my legendary fence, now adorned with vibrant murals celebrating our community's victory. Scout lounged in the dewy grass as I inspected the season's first seedlings, remembering how close we'd come to losing everything to corporate greed. A year had passed since Linda Thompson's conviction. The federal investigation sparked by our resistance had grown into a national movement for agricultural preservation. Agent Martinez now headed a specialized unit dedicated to protecting farming communities from corporate takeover schemes. Their work had already prevented similar attempts in dozens of communities across the country. Maria Rodriguez's law firm had evolved too, specializing in agricultural land protection. Her team trained lawyers nationwide in recognizing and fighting the corporate tactics that threatened farming communities. The precedents established in our case provided legal framework for defending agricultural heritage against development pressure. The transformation of Oak Ridge Estates amazed even its original residents, where stark property lines once divided neighbors. Community gardens now flourished. The development's former clubhouse, once Linda Thompson's command center for harassment operations, had become an agricultural education center. Richard Bennett, despite his advanced age, taught weekly classes on sustainable gardening to eager suburban families. Sarah Collins expanded the Agricultural Heritage Protection Network into a nationwide organization. Their mobile app helped communities document HOA harassment, connect with legal resources, and share successful resistance strategies. The network's database tracked corporate development patterns, allowing them to warn communities before takeover attempts began. Tony Martinez's drone photography business shifted focus entirely to agricultural documentation. His aerial surveys helped communities prove long-term farming use, while his training programs taught other photographers to gather evidence of corporate misconduct. His images of transformed communities inspired similar projects across the country. Pete Davidson's hardware store became a model for rural-urban cooperation. His workshop space hosted regular skill-sharing sessions where experienced farmers taught sustainable practices to suburban neighbors. The tool lending library he established helped new gardeners get started without major investment, breaking down barriers to small-scale farming. Jenny Parker's work in the county office influenced policy changes statewide, New regulations required development proposals to include agricultural impact studies and community input. HOAs faced strict oversight and limitations on their authority, with special protections for existing agricultural operations. Her documentation methods became standard practice in county offices nationwide. Frank Cooper worked with state legislators to strengthen protections for agricultural communities. The resulting legislation, nicknamed the Heritage Farm Protection Act, created legal frameworks for preserving productive farmland against corporate development pressure. Other states began adopting similar measures, creating a nationwide safety net for farming communities. Bob Miller's mentorship program expanded beyond our community, connecting experienced farmers with newcomers eager to learn traditional skills. His curriculum combined practical farming knowledge with strategies for resisting corporate pressure, preparing the next generation to protect agricultural heritage. Diana Foster's real estate practice revolutionized how properties were marketed in mixed agricultural areas. Her farm-connected living certification program helped buyers find communities that valued and protected local agriculture. The waiting list for properties near working farms grew longer each month, proving that people valued authentic rural connections. Amy Chen's continued coverage exposed similar corporate schemes nationwide. Her investigative series, Saving American Farmland, won multiple journalism awards and sparked congressional hearings on agricultural community protection. Her work helped shift public opinion towards supporting local farms against corporate development. Elizabeth Bennett carried her father's legacy forward, serving on the new Oak Ridge Community Council. Under her leadership, the development became a model for sustainable urban-rural cooperation. Their monthly farm-to-table events strengthened bonds between suburban and farming families, creating lasting connections that transcended property lines. The children who once faced restrictions on outdoor play now learned farming skills in community gardens. School curricula incorporated agricultural education, teaching new generations the value of preserving productive farmland. Young people develop deep connections to the land, understanding its importance for their future. Scout, my faithful companion through the entire conflict, still patrolled our strengthened fence, but now he greeted neighbors and visitors with friendly wags, no longer needing to guard against corporate intruders. The fence that sparked our resistance had become a gathering place, its murals telling our story of community triumph over greed. Our victory inspired communities nationwide to stand up against corporate land grabs. The Development Corporation's scheme, intended to destroy agricultural heritage for profit, instead sparked a movement to protect it. Linda Thompson's attempt to divide us had created unbreakable bonds between urban and rural neighbors. Today, walking my fields with morning mist rising from fertile soil, I reflected on how close we came to losing everything. The corporate machine had seemed unstoppable, armed with endless resources and legal manipulation. But they hadn't counted on the strength of united communities, the power of people standing together to protect what matters. My fence stood strong, not as a barrier, but as a monument to resistance. Its surface told our story in vibrant colors and powerful images, inspiring visitors from across the country. Agricultural communities facing similar threats came to learn from our experience, returning home with strategies and hope for their own battles. As the sun rose higher, neighbors gathered for our weekly community breakfast. Oak Ridge residents shared dishes made from locally grown ingredients, their children proudly displaying vegetables from their gardens. The morning air filled with laughter and conversation, a symphony of community connection that no corporate scheme could destroy. Standing by my strengthened fence, watching suburban and farming families mingle freely, I understood that we'd won something far greater than a legal battle. We'd created a new model of community, proving that urban and rural lives could enrich each other. The fence that was meant to divide had become a bridge, connecting people to their food, their neighbors, and their agricultural heritage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.